Yeah, I should use the microphone. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Um, my name is Nathaniel Levy, and thanks for being my audience for the next half an hour or so. I'm here to talk about a venture that I'm a part of called Copyright X, which at its most basic is and was an online course on copyright law, and a venture in open access education and online education. So I should say right off the bat that I'm not going to talk about copyright law itself, which I hope is not a huge disappointment for anybody. If you are here wanting to geek out about copyright law, I'm sure there will be many such presentations for you to do so. Rather, I want to talk a little bit about the design and delivery and ideas that go into producing an online education venture, and a little bit about the space of where open access learning and knowledge sharing is today. I also think it's cool and fitting to be part of a string of sessions on this topic of knowledge sharing tonight, because we're here hosted in part by the Share Foundation. So again, I think it's fitting. And I'm excited to see the subsequent presentations. Don't mind me for a moment. Okay, so I would say that, again, I want to talk mainly about the design brainstorming process that produced the conception for this online course called Copyright X, as well as its delivery and the ways we're beginning to assess it. But I also invite questions and conversation about everyone's interest in online education broadly, perhaps people's experience with this new breed of thing called massive open online courses, their experiences with other online communities, and so forth. So, what is Copyright X? Does anyone know what's pictured on the slide? Any guesses? No, you're kind of guessing. A little bit, no. Okay, so what's on the slide is a garage door opener. Pretty interesting piece of technology, not really. I know I said I wouldn't talk about the content of the course that much, but I think it's interesting to highlight a few of the types of real-world examples that produce cases that engage these students that come out of the ether into an online education course about copyright. So why is this garage door opener pictured on my website? I mean, rather on my slide. So this involved basically a case with a company called Chamberlain that produced garage door openers with code that it protected, because it protected through a type of technology called technological protection mechanisms, which, as many of you probably know, are protected under the DMCA. A second company called Skylink produced competitors to that garage door opener. It undercut Chamberlain's business. Chamberlain got pissed off. It leveled a DMCA suit against Skylink, and it said it was trafficking in technology that challenged technological protection measures. Okay, so this is an interesting case about a rather mundane real-world example, right, that attracted students, that brought them in from the ether into this online education space. But there are other such examples. All right, so with these pictures, we move from the rather mundane to more rich and engaging, I think, and culturally resonant cases that produce learning experiences about copyright. So everyone knows who's pictured on the left. Yeah, Jimi Hendrix, of course, right? So this is a recording of him, rather a picture of him producing the song Little Wing, which was covered many times over the course of subsequent decades and generations, right? So Little Wing is an interesting case with which to consider the mechanics that underlie artists' ability to cover other performers. And the ability to cover tells us interesting things about the way that the copyright system affects music versus other industries. Okay, so this is one, I think perhaps more engaging than the garage door opener example, case that draws students out into this opportunity to learn about copyright. And the other, I hope the picture on the right should be familiar to many people as well. Oh, keep it up, yeah. No, it's not. Does anyone know who the picture on the right is? Kim, what do you say? Yeah, Kim.com, exactly. And what did he do? Yeah, so he's being tried for, I think, infringements related to piracy. He was the founder of Mega Upload, which is a site we're probably all familiar with. And he was arrested in somewhat dramatic fashion last year in New Zealand on his multi-million-dollar estate, and is currently being tried for extradition to the US government. So these three different examples, I think, the garage door opener, Jimi Hendrix and Little Wing, and this pretty flamboyant 6'5", multi-million or billion-dollar internet entrepreneur are all real-world cases, I think, that draw students to the study of copyright. What do you say? Stand a bit closer to the mic. Okay. Apologies. I'm going to stand very close to the mic for the subsequent 20 minutes. And again, I said that the talk isn't going to focus primarily on the subject matter of copyright itself, but it's interesting to look at these examples and see kind of the flavor and the flesh of the case studies that students engage. This is important. Why? So one of the main things that we're interested in online education and in the production of such courses at Harvard, which is where I work, is to better understand the types of students who take massive and open online courses. Right? We want to understand their backgrounds for coming to such courses, or the backgrounds from which they come, their levels of educational attainment and achievement. We want to understand their vocational interests and their intellectual aspirations. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to change courses, we're going to change the offerings based on what students are capable of and interested in. But it does mean that we can curate material differently, and it means we can present material more effectively if we such material, right, about these real-world cases, depending on how we understand students' experiences and interests. So before we go on to describe this picture, I should say a little bit about the context of the course. When it was taught, who taught it, and why. So, I work at a place called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. We study and engage in teaching and advocacy related to a lot of internet and society issues pretty broadly. One of my coworkers is sitting there in the middle row, Andy. And the course was taught by Terry Fisher, who's a Harvard Law School professor and the faculty director of our center, pictured at the left. And it was offered under the auspices of an organization called edX. Has anyone heard of edX? 2 examples. All right, so what's edX? Yeah, totally. So it's an online platform specifically for massive and open online courses. There's a history to such courses and to online education broadly that I can't probably summarize very well in 20 minutes or so, but I would say briefly that in the past 2 years, we have seen an enormous amount of media attention about these things called massive open online courses, or short, MOOCs, right? So this is perhaps best exemplified by the New York Times declaration in 2012 that was the year of the MOOC, because these things exploded everywhere with the rise of companies like Coursera and Udacity and the organization edX. I think we saw a lot of new players with a lot of investment and funding wanting to produce big and open online courses on centralized learning management systems with big data engines backing them up that promise to produce analytics to better understand the types of student experiences and engagement that I said we want to know in the beginning of this presentation. So again, this is a history I can't fully elaborate in brief, but I would say that this new breed of online course was a little bit different than the type of connectivist online course that we'd seen come along in the previous few years. There's sort of a contrast you can draw between MOOCs taught on those three platforms, edX, Coursera, and Udacity, which are called XMOOCs, and CMOOCs, which stands for connectivist MOOCs, which some say are founded on more web-like principles of decentralization and distribution than are the others. I think that our course a little bit treads a fine line in between the two, but I invite comments about that and questions, and I hope that in advance of delivering the course again, we can find ways to draw in the best of both worlds to some extent. So now specifically to what this thing called Copyright X was. I think this image is a pretty simple one. It tells a pretty simple and accessible story. All right, it says that the professor, viewed on the left, in a recording studio, who's recording an online lecture that gets delivered to these online students, reaches students all over the world. His videos reach students in San Salvador, right? So I think this is a basic story that's actually not so new about the internet, not just big and open online courses. It's a story we already know. But I would say that one small kind of footnote to make about this image of the student on the right is that he appears to be a high school student. He appears to be maybe a college student. His laptop is in a neat and somewhat ordered environment. It's on his desk, which has books stacked at the top, a stereo system. He appears to be the kind of student that we recognize as such. Is that the kind of student who really takes these courses? Is that the kind of student we're interacting with online? So I don't know, maybe a guess, right? So do you think most of the students who took an online course about copyright were high schoolers, college students, masters? So if you think that most of our students were college students, I don't know, raise your hands. No, yeah, one. Okay, so college students want to learn about copyright. Law students. With law students in other places, yeah, maybe, two, okay. It's not really so clear, right, who most of the people who take such courses in general are. I think for us, we found that a lot of our students actually were people with master's degree who work in some vocation that requires them to touch copyright, and that they weren't younger than that. So it's really a simple point, but the ways in which we tell these stories in basic ways carries an effect, and it's not always the right story, right? So it's not so clear that these students are actually high school or college students. Okay, so to elaborate then, what was Copyright X? What was this course? So it was networked. It involved multiple communities connected in different ways. It was experimental, by which I mean that we tested certain things out with an experimental design, but that things were also pretty new. And there wasn't always kind of a scientific method to the ways in which we tried out new technologies. We just tried them out. And I hope that each of those characteristics are borne out more in the subsequent slides. But one ways in which those are true is that there were multiple layers to the course design and to the technologies used in the course. So again, there were multiple communities that partook in the course and who interacted with each other. There were hybrid pedagogies. There were experimental combinations of readings about the law and the educational technologies used to deliver them. And then there was a fourth kind of design feature, which I think emerged more over the course of the experience itself and not so much in the brainstorming process, which was that the course team and the teachers in the course, the teaching fellows, who I'll describe more in a moment, kind of formed a community of practice and formed a pretty important individual community among the several that partook in this experiment. And the fifth component, which is obvious and there's not much to say about, is that the course was free, and that's an important principle that I hope endures when it's offered a second time and in subsequent times, as many times as it's offered, is that it will continue to be an open and free online educational experience for its students. Okay, so what were these multiple communities that took part in the course? So first, we should say there was definitely a professor. The way there is in a standard traditional one-to-many historical model of a course. This professor taught both online students, who I call the edX students, and he also taught Harvard Law School students, the HLS students. So there were two different student communities who interacted with each other in small ways, which I'll address at a moment. But really central in the picture is not the professor, but the teaching fellows. So these are Harvard Law School students who both took the copyright course that, as it's been offered at the residential school, and served as individual teachers of discussion sections for the online course. A last component to this, I think, portrait is this idea of a satellite section. So the materials are free and open access, and we enabled groups anywhere in the world, really, to form their own self-organized study groups to engage with the course materials and follow along in lockstep with the course. They weren't assessed, and the courses weren't administered on the same central platform, but they did experience the same materials, and at the end we invited feedback and said, what do you think of the materials? How do you think you might contribute to the set of curricular materials in the next iteration going forward? So these satellites are something I hope we'll return to at the end, and whose role we can amplify in the next iteration. So how did you become a student in an edX section? All right, so it wasn't a massive and open online course. It was just kind of a BOOC. It wasn't a MOOC. It was just a big open online course or an open online course. So there were 500 students that we selected via an application process. It was open to anyone to apply. And we had two main criteria for selecting students. The first was commitment. How committed were you to completing the course? And the ways in which we selected for that were through open-ended response questions. We had an application that asked, 1, why do you want to take this course? 2, what do you hope to get out of it? And 3, have you interacted with copyright in a meaningful way in the past? So do you produce artistic or other expressive materials that require you to understand copyright? Or for your vocation, do you need to know about copyright law? All right, so those were the types of students we selected for, and then they were divided into 20 different sections. So each section, pictured on the left, formed its own community. They had their own discussion forum to discuss any and all facets of the course's contents online asynchronously at different points. And then they also met in real time each week in a video conference environment in a discussion led by their HLS teaching fellow to discuss the work for that week. The Jamaica satellite did something similar, but it met in person. And the HLS students, of course, met multiple times a week in Harvard Law School's buildings, as they have for hundreds of years, really. So this is just a small note about the satellites. It's a picture of one of the students who was in the Jamaican group who met weekly to discuss the Copyright X materials. This guy is a Jamaican singer, a kind of storied reggae musician or producer named Bob Andy. I wasn't actually familiar with his music before this, but have learned from the leader of the Jamaican satellite group that he's rather storied in Jamaica. And I think his participation is notable in that group because he's quite different from the other students who took that, or rather who participated in that section. So our contact in Jamaica went through a law school there and used their facilities, invited law school students, but also leveraged her connections and invited people from various cultural groups. So in some ways, Jamaica has like the highest per capita cultural exports, you might say, to like use a made-up category of any country in the world, because reggae has such global influence and reach. And and its music also spreads around, and then IP issues get really messed up. So it's an interesting case study in which to discuss copyright issues. So a lot of the people who participated in that section, I think, were rather well educated. They had high level. They at least had a bachelor's degree, if not higher. They probably, dealt with these issues daily in their work. Bob Andy maybe deals with these issues all the time, more so than other people, but he, I'm told, barely has, a high achieving level of verbal literacy, or rather of reading literacy. He's someone who doesn't read well, but who knows music better than, anyone else knows how to read probably. So the types of groups that, the single point that this point illustrates is that the type of groups you can form can have a potential high degree of cultural reach in their home communities. And in fact, if anyone is interested in forming self-organized learning groups and teaching copyright in their home environments or home universities, I would be thrilled to hear about that and encourage you to do so and maybe talk to me about it. So again, I said we used hybrid pedagogies. So there were multiple ways to teach the course. So one of the backbones of these new online open courses are video recorded lectures, the types of which you saw our professor filming in the image on the left a few minutes ago, that form a flipped classroom model. A student watches a lecture at home, then goes to meet their fellow section members and teaching fellow for a Socratic discussion weekly in this video conferencing environment. In between, they met via online discussion forums to discuss this stuff asynchronously. I think we found far more success actually with the real-time engagement than with the non-real-time engagement, which is tricky, right? Because one of the fundamental nature of the internet, one of the fundamental characteristics of the internet is that it enables us to connect all the time and in many different ways. In fact, what we did was kind of replicate a face-to-face type of interaction, which we found was more productive than using discussion for us. So ways that we can improve that are definitely on the top of our mind going forward. There were also these special events that were in which there were guest speakers. They would talk to the professor. They would talk with the students. They would meet with the Harvard Law School students like I'm meeting with you now, and then they were webcast live, and we would take questions from the online students. So there were these moments 6 times during the semester where all the different communities, the Jamaican community, the online students spread out across the world, including in El Salvador and other places, and the Harvard Law School students could interact. In terms of the course production, I would spend just a moment on this. I would say that one of the central features of these massive open online course providers is that they have big centralized platforms with big data engines that back them up. But in our case, actually, we had to use several disaggregated pieces of technology. And I think we're a little bit short on time, but I would say that one of the main things that this experience of administering the multiple pieces of technology has taught me is really how much more distance we have to cover in terms of producing really strong data aggregation mechanisms to produce the kind of research that we want to do on these courses, right? So we had about 5 different things that fed into a course database that we pieced along the way. The platform itself, the edX platform itself, wasn't enough to produce the kind of research in situ while the course was going on, or the kind of analytics that would help us make meaningful and nimble adjustments. So there's really a long way to go in terms of building such a robust engine, and it's also worth asking what the limits of building a single centralized robust engine are versus building disaggregated pieces of technology that are still aligned in terms of their metadata that can produce a meaningful set of analytics in the end. I think I will speed through this. So I think there's an important lesson here, which is, as I said, the Harvard Law School students who were the teaching fellows ended up forming a pretty important community of practice. And I think this has lessons for ways people could organize open educational offerings and courses going forward. So we would meet weekly a group of 25 teaching fellows, the course team, myself, and a few others, and the professor to talk about the content and talk about what was going on with the students. And there were a few different issues I think there were three main issues that we tended to address. One was how to use the technology in the course. So a lot of it was clunky, some of it was complicated. It wasn't always intuitive at the least. And there are some interesting moments, I think, of peer coaching. So one of our teaching fellows, now a law school student, or a graduate rather, but formerly he'd been a Warcraft guild master. So he was really used to managing really large-scale chat environments while also talking to people and also playing the game. A lot of people weren't used to simply managing a chat and also managing a voice conversation. In the video conferencing environment in which our students met weekly to have their discussions about copyright, there was a chat and there was a video conference, and students would use both. A lot of our teaching fellows simply weren't familiar, but I think it's cool that we could bring his experience from a native web environment into the course. The third is pedagogy. So as I mentioned, we didn't do too well building in good uses of the discussion fora, but some students in particular kind of went rogue. They built other kind of assignments for their students, and I think they should be commended, right? And having a community in which to discuss that kind of experimentation on the fly is important. Okay, so I'll speed right through to the end. I want to skip to one table, perhaps. So this shows the number of people that completed all 12, that showed up to all 12 weeks of the course, and who passed the course in the end. I think some of the numbers are kind of telling, right? So the highest passage rate of those who completed our final exam had master's degrees and law degrees. So it says that we're reaching a certain kind of engaged demographic, but we're not reaching any and all types of learners. So there's still open questions as for whether or not we could reach more diverse types of learners, or whether or not the course is simply suited to reach a particular kind of student. Finished. Okay. If you have more questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks.